Hi guys, my name is Shane Cuthbert. Welcome back. It's awesome to see you guys here trying to change your life. And, I really just want to support you best I can on the journey. In this lesson, we're going to start talking about something called the Pygmalion effect. Now, one thing that most people do when they attend therapy, they're coming to therapy trying to explore, trying to discover, really trying to uncover their past, okay? That's what most people do. People are just trying to figure out what happened at a younger age that molded them and really shaped them and conditioned them to be the way that they are now. Hoping that they can uncover what created the problems that now that they are an adult, they seem to be stuck with. So when you start exploring, some of the family dynamics about, when you grew up and some of the things that were happening then, the most frustrating thing is that when you discover all of those, problems that you have and that you had them at a younger age, you get frustrated to realize that you're still stuck doing those same problems as an adult, okay? That's the most frustrating thing. You may find that, looking back on your past and now, uncovering that past, that you're attracted or drawn towards similar types of people and personalities, similar types of environmental conditions that contributed to that problem you had at a younger age. You're still doing it now. It's as if those problems we had at a younger age almost just got stuck in our head, okay? It's like they just got stuck there and, for the most part they have, okay? The problems we're having now are because of our conditioning, our upbringing, because of our past. Our past has led us here. One thing that we talked about in one of the first lessons was about, when we're looking at barriers of change, one of those barriers is our unconscious sort of conditioning to seek familiarity, okay? We find safety in familiarity. If we could take familiarity away, okay, if that wasn't a thing, change would actually be really quite easy. Okay, it would be really, really simple. So one of the things that we do is we just like to get ourselves in the same situations, even though they're negative and we don't like them and they don't feel good, we feel comfortable in that space because it's what we've always known. We don't like things that are unfamiliar to us. Essentially, human beings are just the product of their environment. The simplest way to change a person's identity is to change their environment. Take someone and surround them with different people, or you get the people around them to start treating them differently. So that the new way of thinking that the people around you, have starts to condition you and you start to absorb it. You start to take that on board. For example, have you ever known somebody who's just going along in life being the person that you've always known them to be? Then suddenly, they meet some new people, they start hanging around with a different crowd, they get some new friends, and pretty soon you start to see that this person's, become a different person. You say, oh my God, since that person found that partner, they've become a different person. Or, since that person found that group of friends, they treat me differently now. They've almost become a completely different person just because the people that they are associating themselves with now, the new crowd they're hanging out with is different. Now, whether that's a good or bad thing depends on whether or not, that new crowd is a good or bad influence. Unfortunately, for most people, it's just not that easy, okay? It's not that simple. That's because we are just naturally repelled and driven away from people that think differently, okay? Because they're unfamiliar to us. Attracted to those people that's, thinking is familiar. We get along easier with people that have the same thoughts and the same views as us naturally. We fit in with those people. We're naturally attracted to and drawn to people whose thinking is much more similar, with ours. The people that think the same way and act the same way. Now, whether those people, in our past, are good or bad for us, well, that depends on the particular past that we've had. Our future and the environment that we create for ourselves moving forward, that's something we can control. Now, parents know that a lot of the problems that we have now as an adult are there because, we had those same problems growing up. So, as parents, we try to do our best to make sure that our children don't experience those same problems by providing them with better environmental opportunities than what we had as children. You know, we're trying to make sure that our children don't have the same problems that we have. Let me share with you a powerful example of what happens, just how powerful the effect other people have on us growing up. The original research into this was done by a man called Robert Rosenthal. So he was a professor of psychology at Harvard University. Rosenthal and his colleagues went into primary schools. They did some IQ tests and also some ability tests like puzzles with a whole bunch of random children. Now those researchers then pulled aside, the parents and teachers of those students and told them that certain students' results indicated that they were late bloomers. In other words, they said that these, students had enormous potential and would probably start showing signs of being, particularly intelligent or smart, intellectually gifted, sometime over the next coming, weeks or months. Now, the researchers' tests were supposedly able to predict that. So after a few months, guess what? It turns out after a few months, their predictions were actually right, okay? They predicted that these late bloomers were going to, all of a sudden become intelligent, in a couple of weeks or months from now. And that's exactly what happened. These late bloomers eventually all became, really intelligent or particularly gifted. Those same kids that the researchers said showed signs of being intellectually gifted actually started showing those signs of being intellectually gifted. Their academic performance started to boost, and they actually started showing signs of being brighter and more academically confident in comparison with the other kids. Now, here's the interesting part of the story. The researchers actually picked those children at random. The things that those researchers told those children weren't exactly true. Those teachers and those parents were lied to. In actual reality, the kids were just given a dummy test. Then the researchers picked certain kids at random and said that their tests predicted that those specific kids, were going to obviously achieve better later. They were going to bloom. They were late bloomers, and they were going to show signs of being intellectually gifted. Just think about that. These were normal, average kids, ordinary children with no signs of gifted ability at all. The only thing that actually changed for them as a result were the expectations of the parents and the teachers. So what that study actually shows is that when children are growing up during their developmental years, those adults that are in, positions of authority around them, like parents and teachers, essentially mold those students. They're molding their identities. The way that those adults around them view them and their expectations of them influences the interactions and the dynamic they have. Then, as a result of the change in dynamic between them, it starts to change those children's identities. Think about that when it comes to influencing the dynamic we have between our own inner child. Knowing that we have the ability to, change the way that inner child is behaving or thinking or feeling. And, it's a bit of a responsibility to have, but just knowing how powerful it is that we can actually make a difference and we can actually make that change occur. That's a crazy thing to think about, to have that power. Again, it's important when we're looking at our inner child, okay, our inner children that's inside of us, to focus on the effort over those outcomes and to break down all the steps along the way towards achieving those goals, and to compartmentalize and break down, all the steps and make them smaller, as small as you need to make them, so that they can break down that black and white thinking and instead adopt a growth mindset. If we focus on every step of progress and we create that momentum, irrespective of how, the outcome, basically, irrespective of, what is achieved or what goals are done and what boxes are ticked, we're going to build that, that identity. We're really going to have that identity change if we're able to do those three things. When parents and teachers focus on the problems, okay, so when they're focused on, this child isn't achieving this or this child isn't doing that, what happens, it unconsciously changes the way in which they treat that child then as a result, which then only impacts on the way that child views themselves in the world and molds their identity around it. So if your parents and teachers are only focused on your problems, that child's going to grow up looking in the mirror, reflecting on itself, only focusing on its problems and not focusing on, the steps and the ability to change. That child's going to have a fixed mindset. From similar studies, researchers did the exact opposite. They told some teachers and parents that, specific children were going to start showing signs of delayed intellectual ability, okay? So that they were behind. They would start to slow down in their performance. And lo and behold, those same students started to show a decline in their results, in their outcomes, due to their teacher and parents' change in those expectations. So for those of you watching this that are parents or teachers or in a particular position of authority when it comes to children, I hope I've given you a better understanding of how, you can speak with that child and interact with them and condition them so that they have a growth mindset and that they're able to achieve. Just by changing your expectations and the way that you communicate with that child, you can really do wonders for that child's future. Now, how do we do that with adults? Because, it's not as simple as just changing the environment around us. Or is it? Just like the cyclical relationship between our thoughts and feelings, it's also, good for us to understand the cycle that's happening between our identity and our interactions with others. Okay, the way other people see us has a huge impact on the way that we see ourselves and see our own identity. But then, as a result, the way that we see ourselves and the identity that, we seem to have formed has a big impact on the way that we act and the things that we do, in our life, which keeps us stuck in that cycle where we don't change. We can see that in the way that we react with other people and the way that we show, feelings and emotions in certain situations. And then the result of that is the way that we, show others to be, the way we act and react around other people, gives them an impression of who we are, which then shapes the way in which they treat us, which then just impacts it back on our identity and keeps us acting the same way we are, keeps us going around in circles. So the trick, and this is a difficult one, is what we need to do is we need to just change the way we are with ourselves and treat ourselves and the way that we act so that the way that others respond to us is going to be more in line with, the person who we want to be. So they're going to, get around us and they're going to support that change. And that's a lot easier said than done. This is really just a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it's something that people call the Pygmalion effect. Okay, it explains, it's a name given to that cyclical effect of how things become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the real question moving forward is, what's the easiest way for us to change that environmental voice that's around us on the outside without forcing ourselves to pretend to be somebody else? Here's a personal example. A few years ago, I started seeing, a few different therapists myself. After a while, I started to notice, some recurring themes and some recurring patterns in those experiences. Once you get to know someone well enough, you can sort of predict what, they're going to say or how they're going to act. You know what I mean? Once you get to know someone really well, you can really sort of get, what they're going to say before they say it, what they're going to do before they do it. That's just because you've become familiar with their way of thinking. So in between sessions, if something bad sort of happened to me, I'd find myself thinking, how do I explain this to, my therapist? Now, after thinking that way, after a while, you sort of get familiar with trying to predict, after having that thought in your mind, how am I going to tell this person this thing? You start to already be able to almost predict, what they're going to say. So it sort of becomes a habit for you to, you get to that situation where you don't really necessarily have to tell them about those problems or those things that happen, because you already know what they would say about that thing. I learned how to basically, when I was in those moments, stop and ask myself, what would my therapist say right now? I just made that a new habit. I started stopping myself, recognizing when I was having those thoughts or those feelings, and think, okay, what would my therapist say about that? What would their opinion or view be about that? And then before long, if someone would come along and start telling me about their own problems, I started noticing that the way in which that I would respond to them was really reflecting or mirroring, a very, very similar way of thinking that I had, learnt over time from my therapist. It was almost as if the therapist's voice had started to, find its way in to my own way of thinking, filter its way through. As was identified during the famous Rosenthal studies, the way that adults interact with children tends to mould their identity. When those interactions change, so too does their identity. Likewise, the way that people around us interact with us affects our identity also. Therefore, changing the people around us or their interactions would be an easy way to change our own identity. Problem is, however, that we tend to be attracted to similar types of people and attract similar treatment to what we have grown up being familiar with, thus creating a vicious cycle that keeps us stuck. The simplest way to change the interactions we have with the people around us is by selecting the right therapist.